The period between 1960 and 1980 was one of the most tumultuous in American political history. Of the 5 presidents who served in the White House during that period, only 3 were elected. One assumed office following an assassination, another after a resignation. Cold War tensions, the Vietnam War, Watergate, and the energy crisis of the 70s all added to a general sense of unease in America. Along with political upheavals, this was a period of extraordinary social change in the United States. The civil rights movement was beginning to pick up momentum, and suburban America was growing at a rapid pace. Even though the United States was the richest country in the world, there was still a large segment of the population living in poverty, and the U.S. economy, which had generated unprecedented prosperity since World War II, was experiencing a slowdown. It was against this backdrop that the 1960 presidential campaign occurred, pitting Vice President Richard M. Nixon against Massachusetts Senator John F. Kennedy. In the beginning of the campaign, Vice President Nixon had a definite advantage. He had served 8 years under an immensely popular President, Dwight Eisenhower, and was much better known than Kennedy. Kennedy faced another problem. He was a Catholic in a country where prejudice and convention meant that no Catholic had ever been elected president. On the evening of September 26, 1960, Nixon and Kennedy faced each other in the very first televised presidential debate. Those who heard the debate on the radio judged it a draw, but the larger television audience rated Kennedy the winner. Nixon, coming off a recent illness, seemed haggard and drawn, but Kennedy appeared well-rested and confident.
Nixon's problem is that he was far less savvy about television than Kennedy was. Kennedy had already learned that the camera was his friend, and so he had makeup applied before he appeared on camera. Nixon refused to have makeup. He thought it was apparently unmanly or something of that kind.
Mr. Nixon, would you like to comment on that statement?
I have no comment.
This debate not only changed the course of the 1960 election, but it signaled the emergence of television as a powerful new force in American politics.
Because it's Columbus Day, we ought to have a speech in Italian.
Throughout the campaign, the energetic young Kennedy and his stylish wife Jackie captivated the public and the press. In the end, Kennedy won the election by one of the most narrow margins in history, and the influence of television may very well have given him the extra votes he needed. At his inauguration, Kennedy challenged all Americans to help reach the new frontier, the name he gave to his program for America's future.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Kennedy embodied the anything was possible spirit of the day. One of the most successful programs Kennedy established was the Peace Corps. Thousands of idealistic Americans heeded his call and became teachers, healthcare workers, and technicians in less developed countries. The space program would also become a cornerstone of the Kennedy administration. After Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth in 1961, Kennedy vowed to put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. In 1962, astronaut John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And in 1969, astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first men to walk on the moon, making Kennedy's pledge a reality. During his election campaign, Kennedy had also promised to address the economic recession and get America moving again. Aided by a Democratic Congress, Kennedy pushed laws that would help stimulate the struggling economy. Yet despite the Democratic majority, much of the power in Congress rested with a powerful conservative group of Republicans and Southern Democrats. They opposed Kennedy's main economic proposal, an across-the-board tax cut that would give people more money to spend, thus stimulating economic growth. They feared that if taxes were cut, the government would not have enough money and our national debt would increase. The Southern conservatives also influenced how Kennedy chose to handle the growing civil rights movement. Kennedy moved cautiously, limiting his actions to presidential orders that didn't require congressional approval. He established the Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity to ensure that all races had equal access to government jobs. He ordered the Interstate Commerce Commission to desegregate bus routes in the South. At the same time, Attorney General Robert Kennedy was involved in helping black students gain admittance to 2 previously all-white colleges. In 1963, pressured by public outrage over televised acts of brutality against protesters, Kennedy proposed a comprehensive Civil Rights Act that would make racial discrimination in public accommodations illegal and would empower the Attorney General to intercede in public school desegregation. Southern conservatives mobilized against it, and Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill quickly became stalled in Congress. In addition to the civil rights crisis at home, Kennedy's attention was also focused on a number of overseas incidents that were a direct result of the ongoing Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Shortly after he became president, Kennedy approved the invasion of Cuba by Cuban nationals who wanted to overthrow Soviet-backed communist dictator Fidel Castro. The Kennedy administration supported the overthrow attempt as a means of containing the expansion of communism. But when Kennedy refused to approve U.S. air support, the invasion at the Bay of Pigs was doomed, and the incident turned into a political fiasco. Cold War tensions escalated even further in June 1961. The communist government of East Germany, backed by the Soviet Union, constructed the Berlin Wall in East Berlin to stop its citizens from fleeing to democratic West Berlin. When Kennedy did not order American troops to tear down the wall, the Soviet Union felt that they could challenge the United States.
Remember, both of them were armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. They were on a constant state of ready alert, which meant that for the Soviet Union to put up a Berlin Wall meant that it was risking that entire balance of terror. For the United States to attempt to tear down the wall would have also meant a possibility of affecting that balance of terror.
In October 1962, the U.S. and the Soviet Union went to the brink of nuclear war over the Soviet placement of nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the American mainland. Kennedy's response of a limited shipping blockade instead of an invasion of the island allowed time for cooler heads to prevail. Historians agree that Kennedy's firm stand against the Soviet Union prevented what could have been World War III and marked his finest hour as president. Despite the problems getting his New Frontier programs through Congress, most Americans thought Kennedy would be re-elected. But it was not to be. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated while riding in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas. Despite speculation about a conspiracy, an exhaustive investigation by Chief Justice Earl Warren and the Warren Commission concluded that one man, Lee Harvey Oswald, acted alone in killing Kennedy. Historians still debate whether Kennedy's presidency was a success or failure, but his greatest legacy may have been infusing the country with optimism and a sense of hope for the future. After Kennedy's assassination, his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, assumed the presidency. Johnson promised to ensure passage of Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill as a memorial to the slain president. However, Southern conservatives continued to fight the legislation. So President Johnson went to work, using the experience he had gained as Senate Majority Leader.
Johnson displayed his really extraordinary political skills and power in being able to transform what had been a Washington in which civil rights legislation was impossible into one in which it was enthusiastically embraced.
The landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited racial discrimination in public accommodations, forbade discrimination by employers, and banned the use of different voter registration standards for blacks and whites. Now Johnson was ready for an even greater challenge. Like President Kennedy, Johnson had been greatly influenced by Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, which painted a wrenching picture of poverty in America. Johnson was inspired to commit billions of dollars to this cause. The war on poverty, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were to be the centerpieces of what Johnson called the Great Society. His first victory in the war on poverty came with the passage of the Economic Opportunity Act, which created a variety of social programs designed to help people improve their lives, such as Job Corps, which provided training for the unemployed, and Head Start, an educational program for poor preschool children. In the 1964 presidential election, Johnson beat his Republican challenger, Senator Barry Goldwater, by a landslide. This lopsided victory also brought with it a large number of liberal senators and congressmen who shared Johnson's belief in the beneficial power of government. The new Congress passed numerous programs, including Medicare, a health insurance program for the elderly, and Medicaid, medical insurance for the poor, and federal aid for education. President Johnson also proposed legislation to reform U.S. immigration policy. Since World War I, U.S. policy had been based on a quota system that favored European immigrants. The Immigration Act of 1965 opened doors to more diversity, resulting in an increase in America's population of Asian and Hispanic people. As President Johnson pushed for his Great Society, several decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court had a great impact on civil liberties. The court banned prayer and Bible reading in public schools to protect the rights of religious minorities. The landmark case, Gideon versus Wainwright, required states to provide poor criminal defendants with an attorney, and Miranda versus Arizona required the police to inform criminal suspects of their rights. Johnson's Great Society was built on the assumption that America's booming economy would continue producing more than enough revenue to meet the government's needs. But Johnson hadn't taken into account the expense of fighting the Vietnam War. With the costs related to troops and equipment, there simply wasn't enough to adequately fund the Great Society programs, and many experienced cutbacks. In addition to taking a toll on the country's economy, the war was dividing the American people as well. On March 31, 1968, President Johnson stunned the American people by announcing that he would decline to run for re-election.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
As the Republican challenger for the presidency in the election of 1968, Richard Nixon promised to quell the protests, restore law and order, and end the Vietnam War. His message spoke to conservative Americans who felt that the United States was out of control. Nixon called this group the Silent Majority. With their help, Nixon defeated Johnson's Vice President Hubert Humphrey. Nixon inherited a country in turmoil. In addition to the Vietnam War protests, there was continuing trouble in the nation's inner cities. For Nixon, the root of the nation's problems was not poverty or injustice, but what he called a whole era of permissiveness. He began his assault on that era by chipping away at some of the remaining Great Society social programs that he thought provided a disincentive to work. On the economic front, President Nixon's biggest problem was inflation, a steady increase in the price of goods, which reduced the purchasing power of many Americans, specifically those living on fixed incomes, like the poor and the retired. Traditionally, the government's way to fight inflation was to cut government spending, hoping that would cause prices to go down. President Nixon tried that, but it didn't work. Next, Nixon declared a freeze on prices, wages, and rents for 90 days, followed by a period of voluntary wage and price controls. These measures slowed the rise of inflation, but only temporarily. At the time of the 1972 presidential election, Nixon's economic measures seemed to be working. He was also drawing high marks for several foreign policy successes. Nixon's unprecedented trip to China helped open lines of communication that had been closed since the communist takeover of that country in 1949. American involvement in the Vietnam War had been drastically reduced, and American soldiers were coming home. And a dramatic overture to the Soviet Union had resulted in a historic arms control agreement. The American public rewarded President Nixon with a landslide victory, and Nixon used his public approval to try and halt the trend toward increased spending on social programs that had begun under previous administrations. He passed legislation that returned billions of dollars and the power to spend it to the states, in turn diminishing the power of Congress. Generally, Nixon sought to strengthen the power of the president over the Congress, setting off a struggle between those two branches of government. In 1973, inflation was again on the rise. A series of budget deficits resulted from government spending on the Vietnam War. An Arab embargo of oil shipments to the U.S. quadrupled oil prices. The price of gasoline soared, and no gas signs were common. The voluntary wage and price controls instituted by Nixon to combat the problem were not working. So he set rigid limits on how much the federal government spent and refused to spend money for programs already appropriated by the Democrat-controlled Congress. Later on in his term, the American public found out that the White House's struggles with Congress were part of a larger pattern of contempt for other branches of government. On June 17, 1972, 5 months before Nixon's landslide election, a team of 5 men linked to President Nixon's re-election committee were arrested while attempting to burglarize and install listening devices at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. The burglars had been hired by President Nixon's re-election committee, and their arrest touched off one of the worst political scandals in American history. Concerned by what the arrest might mean for their re-election chances, top White House aides, with President Nixon's approval, tried to cover up White House involvement by preventing the FBI and other police agencies from investigating the break-in on grounds of national security. What followed was a battle between Congress and the President that challenged the power of the presidency as well as the roles of the Congress and the courts.
The Watergate crisis became a national detective story. The entire country focused on television as revelation after revelation emerged, creating a more and more conclusive case that Nixon had been involved in the cover-up. An entire nation focused on trying to discover whether, in Nixon's own words, your president is a crook.
Finally, facing almost certain impeachment and removal from office, Nixon resigned the presidency on August 9, 1974.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
The Watergate scandal ultimately led to the conviction and sentencing of 20 men, including President Nixon's top aides. Yet its most damaging effect was how it undermined public respect and trust for the office of the president. When President Nixon resigned in 1974, Gerald Ford, a former Republican congressman from Michigan, became president. Ford was selected by Nixon in late 1973 to replace Vice President Spiro Agnew, who resigned rather than face bribery charges. Ford entered the White House at a time when public confidence in the government was low. He resolved to restore honor and decency to the presidency, and to help bring the Watergate era to an end. But the road would not be an easy one. Ford began his term by pardoning Richard Nixon, a controversial act that probably cost him election to a full term in 1976. Ford presided over Vietnam's final chapter and agreed to evacuate thousands of people before the fall of Saigon. To make matters worse, late in 1974, the already struggling economy went into a severe recession. Unemployment rose to levels not seen since the Great Depression, and the Democratic Congress made fighting unemployment its top priority. But many of the bills introduced to accomplish this exceeded the tight budget President Ford had proposed to fight inflation. As a result, Ford vetoed the bills time and time again. The weak economy and the Watergate scandal gave the Democrats an edge in the 1976 presidential race, and a little-known former Georgia governor named Jimmy Carter was able to defeat President Ford by a narrow margin.
I told you I didn't intend to lose.
Carter had campaigned as a political outsider, someone untainted by Washington scandals. Experts predicted he would easily hold on to the White House for 2 terms, but the fact that Carter was an outsider quickly proved to be a liability. His economic program, reining in federal spending to fight inflation rather than increasing federal spending to reduce unemployment, angered many Democrats. Despite Carter's efforts, unemployment lines grew longer and inflation soared. By his 4th year in office, Carter had dampened inflation slightly, but unemployment was still high. Aside from the economy, Carter's biggest problem was the energy crisis brought on by the United States' growing dependence on foreign oil, specifically from the Middle East. In one of his few legislative successes, President Carter lifted the lid on oil and gas prices imposed by President Nixon, allowing them to rise to world market levels. As Carter entered his 4th year in office, America's economic problems continued, and a major foreign policy crisis had developed in the Middle East. In November 1979, Iranian revolutionaries invaded the American embassy and took 66 Americans hostage. The Iranians were angered by Carter's decision to admit the Shah of Iran, the country's former ruler, to the U.S. for medical treatment. The crisis dragged on throughout 1980 and included a failed attempt to rescue the hostages, in which 8 U.S. servicemen died.
It's the sort of thing you see in action movies, but you never see in real life, where the rescuers were going to chopper into the prison where the American consulate staff and Marines were held and shoot their way out somehow.
Public frustration over the handling of the crisis helped send Carter's approval level plummeting to the worst rating of any American president in history. Carter's presidency did have its successes. Shortly before leaving office, Carter succeeded in passing a $1.6 billion toxic waste bill to clean up hundreds of old chemical dumps and a law to make 100 million acres of Alaska land off-limits to development. In response to the nation's dependence on foreign oil, Carter took up the cause of conserving energy and finding alternative energy sources. One of those sources, nuclear energy, would be the cause of some of Jimmy Carter's most dramatic moments as president. Faced with a near disaster, when the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant malfunctioned in March 1979, President Carter kept a close watch on the situation and reassured the nation by personally visiting the site with his wife, Rosalind. As the 1980 presidential election approached, the political landscape had changed dramatically from that of 20 years earlier. Gone were the visions of unending, limitless prosperity. Faith in the government's ability to solve problems at home, as well as its image as a world power, had been severely shaken. The hostage crisis, inflation, unemployment, and political turmoil had left many Americans uneasy about the nation's future.